The darkness that swallowed the mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue was not merely the absence of light. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of silence that had settled over the property like a curse. For weeks, the neighbors in the affluent town of Westfield, New Jersey, had watched the grand Victorian house with a growing sense of unease. It was a behemoth of a structure, boasting 19 rooms, including a ballroom, but it stood freezing and desolate against the biting December wind. Initially, the house had been ablaze with light. Every single bulb and every chandelier and lamp had burned furiously, day and night, casting long, frantic shadows against the drawn curtains. It looked like a desperate celebration that refused to end, a lighthouse warning ships away from a jagged coast. But entropy is inevitable. Slowly, mechanically, the light bulbs began to surrender. One by one, the rooms flickered and died, plunging sections of the house into an abyss. The neighbors watched this slow-motion death of the house with a knot in their stomachs. They hadn't seen the children playing in the yard for a month. They hadn't seen the wife tending to the garden. There was no movement, no laughter, no life. Just the house, staring back at the street with its darkening, empty eyes, guarding a secret that was rotting behind the mahogany doors. When the police finally arrived on the night of December 7, 1971, prompted by the concerns of the children's drama teacher, they were not prepared for the sensory assault that awaited them. The air inside was frigid, colder than the winter night outside, because the thermostat had been deliberately sabotaged to preserve something or someone. But the cold could not mask the smell. It was a thick, cloying stench of decay that clung to the officers' uniforms, a smell that signaled the violent end of biology. Cutting through the silence and the smell was music, a haunting, crackling recording of Lutheran hymns played on an endless, maddening loop over the house's intercom system. The religious choir sang of salvation and mercy, their voices echoing through the hallways where blood had dried on the floorboards. The officers followed the smell and the music to the grand ballroom. There, under a magnificent stained-glass skylight, they found the source of the horror. Neatly arranged on sleeping bags, positioned with the precision of a church service, lay the bodies of the entire List family, the wife, the mother, the 3 children. They were laid out in a cross formation, as if part of some twisted sacrificial ritual. But the patriarch, the man who paid the mortgage, was missing. In his place, he left a 5-page letter, penned with the steady hand of an accountant, explaining that he had not murdered them out of malice. He had butchered them to save their souls from a world he could no longer control. Welcome back to the archives of the wicked, here at Behind the Mask. We often tell ourselves that monsters look like monsters, that they have wild eyes, jagged teeth, and live in the shadows of society. It is a comforting lie we whisper to sleep at night. But the truth, the one that makes the blood run cold, is that the most dangerous monsters wear suits. They go to church every Sunday. They teach Sunday school to your children. They are polite, soft-spoken, and utterly unremarkable. They are the neighbors who wave to you while checking the mail, hiding a catastrophe behind a smile that never quite reaches their eyes. Today, we are dissecting the mind of John List, a man who epitomized the banality of evil. He was a devoutly religious accountant, so obsessed with the facade of the American dream that he decided it was better to systematically annihilate his entire bloodline than to admit he had lost his job. This is not a crime of passion. Passion implies heat, anger, and loss of control. This was a crime of ice-cold calculation, a massacre planned with the same meticulous attention to detail as a tax return. It is a story about a man who wore a mask of sanity so convincing that after wiping his family from the face of the earth, he managed to vanish into thin air, starting a new life with a new name and a new wife, while his first family decomposed in a freezing ballroom. How does a father look into the eyes of his children, cheer for them at a soccer game, and then drive them home to execute them? And how, after 18 years of freedom, did a piece of clay sculpture finally drag him back to hell? Before we peel back the skin of this story, I need you to join our investigation. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a dossier. Like this video to help us expose these stories to the world. And I want to know where you are watching from. Go to the comments right now and tell me which country and city you are in. Let's see how far the darkness reaches tonight. Now, take a deep breath. We are going in. November 9th, 1971, broke cold and gray. It was a Tuesday inside Breeze Knoll. The air was heavy with the silence of impending doom. John List woke up early, as he always did. He dressed in a crisp shirt and tie, maintaining his costume even for the act of annihilation. He went down to the kitchen, where the smell of brewing coffee usually signaled the start of a mundane day. But today, the metallic scent of gun oil would replace the aroma of breakfast. He had purchased a 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic handgun and a .22 caliber revolver months prior, weapons chosen for efficiency. Helen was sitting at the kitchen table, perhaps nursing a hangover, perhaps just staring into the void of her unhappy marriage. She was drinking her coffee. John approached her from behind. He didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't offer a final word of goodbye or an explanation for his failure as a provider. He simply raised the Steyr to the back of her head and pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot was swallowed by the massive house. Helen collapsed, her coffee spilling, her life extinguished instantly. The first domino had fallen, but the work was not done. Upstairs, his 84-year-old mother Alma was still in her room on the third floor. She was the woman who had doted on him, who had shaped his rigid worldview. John climbed the stairs, the gun heavy in his hand. Alma asked him what the noise downstairs had been. "Nothing, mother," he might have said. He kissed her on the forehead, a Judas kiss, and then shot her above the left eye. The woman who gave him life was now a corpse in the attic. Now, we arrive at the detail that separates John List from a man who snapped and identifies him as a creature of pure, hollow evil. With two bodies cooling in his home, John went back downstairs to the kitchen. The blood was likely still fresh on the floor. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, and John List made himself lunch. He didn't pace, he didn't vomit, he made a sandwich. He sat at the table, just feet away from his dead wife, and he ate. He chewed, he swallowed. When he was finished, he stood up and washed the dishes. He dried them and put them away in the cupboard. He cleaned the counter. He was an accountant, and in his mind, the books had to be balanced, the mess had to be contained. This ritual of domestic normality in the middle of a slaughterhouse reveals a mind completely detached from humanity. He wasn't dissociating, he was functioning perfectly. To him, the murders were just tasks on a to-do list, sandwiched between lunch and cleanup. He then went to the basement and dragged the body of his wife across the polished ballroom floor, placing her on a sleeping bag. He went upstairs and dragged his mother's heavy body down 3 flights of stairs, laying her next to Helen. He covered their faces with towels. Not out of respect, but because he didn't want to look at them. And then, he sat in a chair and waited. The house was quiet again, but the school bus was coming. The children were coming home to a father who had already decided they would never grow up. To understand the carnage, we must first understand the cage. John List was not a man of flesh and blood. He was a construct of expectations. Born into a strict Lutheran family in Michigan, he was molded from birth to be a figure of authority, repression, and absolute order. He was a man who viewed the world through a binary lens. There was righteousness, and there was sin. There was success, and there was damnation. There was no gray area. By 1971, John had constructed what he believed was the perfect life. He had a wife, Helen, 3 intelligent children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick, and his elderly mother Alma, living with him. And to house this perfect family, he bought Breeze Knoll, the most imposing mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. Breeze Knoll was more than a house. It was a stage set for John's performance of success. With its 19 rooms, marble fireplaces, and Tiffany-stained glass, it projected wealth and stability. But inside, the walls were closing in. The house was a financial black hole, devouring every cent John earned. It was a mausoleum of debt. To make matters worse, the family dynamic was rotting from the inside out. Helen, his wife, was suffering from advanced syphilis contracted from her first husband, secrets she had kept from John for years. She was descending into alcoholism and madness, creating a chaotic environment that terrified John's obsession with order. His daughter, Patricia, a teenager dreaming of an acting career, was rebelling against his suffocating religious rules. She smoked, she talked back, she engaged in witchcraft, or so John believed. Then came the final blow. At the age of 46, John List lost his job as a vice president at a bank. For a normal man, this would be a crisis to be shared and solved with his family. For a narcissist like John, it was an apocalyptic event. He could not bear the shame of admitting failure. He could not stand the idea of his neighbors pitying him. So, he began the charade. Every morning he put on his suit, grabbed his briefcase, and kissed his family goodbye. He convinced himself that sending them to heaven immediately, while they were still relatively innocent, was the only way to ensure their eternal souls were safe. He wasn't a monster in his own eyes. He was a savior. He spent weeks planning the logistics. He stopped the milk delivery. He stopped the mail. He began the process of erasing his family from the world, not out of hatred, but out of a terrifying, twisted love. The afternoon sun began to dip, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn of Breeze Knoll. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the breathing of the man waiting in the dark. Patricia, his 16-year-old daughter, was the first to arrive home. She was a vibrant girl, full of life, drama, and the rebellious spirit that John so despised. She walked through the front door, likely complaining about school or the cold, unsuspecting that she was stepping into a tomb. As she entered the kitchen, John shot her in the jaw. She didn't die instantly. The horror of those final moments, looking up at her father, is unimaginable. He shot her again to finish the job. Next was Frederick, the youngest, 13 years old, a small, quiet boy. He came in shortly after Patricia. John dispatched him with the same mechanical efficiency. A single shot, a small body crumpling to the floor. John dragged them both to the ballroom, lining them up next to their mother and grandmother. The symmetry was important to him. He was creating a tableau, a final family portrait of obedience. But there was one child left, the eldest son, the namesake, John Jr. John Jr. was playing in a soccer game that afternoon. In a display of psychopathy that defies comprehension, John List locked the house containing 4 corpses, got into his car, and drove to the soccer field. He stood on the sidelines, among other cheering parents. He watched his son run, he clapped, he smiled. He played the role of the proud father perfectly, knowing that the boy running on the grass had less than an hour to live. When the game ended, he drove John Jr. home. They probably talked about the game. Maybe they talked about dinner. As they entered the house, John Jr. must have noticed the silence. He might have seen something wrong in the kitchen. Unlike the others, John Jr. did not go down without a fight. Evidence suggests he realized what was happening. He tried to defend himself, he tried to run, but his father was determined. John emptied the gun into his own son, shooting him 10 times. It was an overkill that suggested a deep, resentful rage towards the boy who represented his legacy. With the massacre complete, John dragged his son to the ballroom. He placed him with the others. He then walked around the house, methodically turning on every single light. He tuned the radio to a religious station and piped it through the intercom system, filling the house with hymns. He sat at his mahogany desk and wrote the 5-page letter to his pastor, justifying his actions as a mercy killing. "At least I'm certain that all have gone to heaven now," he wrote. If things had gone on, who knows if that would be the case. He slept in the house that night. He slept soundly, surrounded by the bodies of the people he was supposed to protect. The next morning he cut his own face out of every family photograph in the house, leaving jagged holes where the father used to be. He cancelled the newspaper delivery. He turned down the thermostat to slow the decomposition. And then, John List walked out the back door, got into his car, and drove away, leaving the lights burning as a final, ghostly vigil for the dead. John List didn't just run, he evaporated. He drove his car to Kennedy Airport in New York, but he didn't get on a plane. He left the car there as a decoy to confuse the police. He took a bus back into the city, then a train to Michigan, and eventually drifted to Denver, Colorado. He shed the skin of John List like a snake. He became Robert Clark, a fry cook, and later, once again, an accountant. The man who had slaughtered his family because he could unbear the shame of poverty was now working menial jobs, living in a small apartment, and seemingly content. Back in Westfield, the horror was just beginning. It took a month for the bodies to be discovered by then. The trail was ice cold. The police found the car at the airport, but no flight manifest had his name. They chased leads across the globe, searching for a man with thick glasses and a scar behind his ear. But John List was a ghost. He was the invisible man. The FBI placed him on their most wanted list, but years turned into decades. The case became a legend, a bedtime story told to scare children in New Jersey. The boogeyman was real, and he had gotten away with it. In Denver, Bob Clark was building a new life. He joined a Lutheran church. He was active in the choir. He was the quiet, nice guy at the potluck dinners who brought the best potato salad. He met a woman named Dolores Miller. They fell in love. They got married. Dolores had no idea she was sleeping next to a mass murderer. She knew him as a gentle soul who wouldn't hurt a fly. He even adopted the role of a stepfather to her children. The irony was sickening. He had killed his own flesh and blood to avoid poverty, but now he lived a modest life with a new family, proving that the murder was never about money, it was about his ego. Occasionally, the cracks would show. Neighbors noticed that Bob Clark was strange. He was obsessive about privacy. He never wanted his picture taken. If a camera came out at a party, he would duck away or put his hand up. He told people his first wife had died of cancer. He spun a web of lies so intricate that he began to believe them himself. He was happy. He had won. He had erased his sins and started over with a clean slate. Meanwhile, Breeze Knoll burned to the ground in 1972, destroyed by an arsonist. The physical evidence of the tragedy was gone. It seemed as though the universe was conspiring to help John List forget. But justice is a patient hunter. It doesn't always run. Sometimes it waits. 18 years had passed. The world had changed. But the face of John List, preserved in the black and white police files, was waiting for a chance to be seen again. By 1989, the John List case was ancient history to everyone except the detectives who refused to let it go. In a last-ditch effort, the producers of the new TV show America's Most Wanted decided to feature the case. But they had a problem. The only photos they had of John List were nearly 2 decades old. A man changes in 20 years. His hair grays, his skin sags, his features shift. If they showed the old photo, no one would recognize the elderly Bob Clark. They hired Frank Bender, a forensic sculptor renowned for his ability to age-progress faces. Bender didn't just use science, he used psychology. He studied John List's profile. He read the letters. He understood the man's vanity. Bender theorized that a man as rigid and arrogant as List would not have undergone plastic surgery or changed his style significantly. He would still be wearing the same type of glasses-thick black frames that hung low on the nose. Bender sculpted a bust of an old balding man with a scowl and those specific distinctive glasses. It was a masterpiece of intuition. On May 21, 1989, the episode aired. Millions of people watched. Among them was a woman in Richmond, Virginia, where Bob and Dolores had recently moved. She looked at the clay bust spinning on her television screen. The hair stood up on the back of her neck. The bust didn't just look like someone she knew. It was her neighbor, Bob. The glasses, the frown, the jawline. It was identical. She called the hotline. 11 days later, the FBI knocked on the door of the quiet accountant. Bob Clark answered. When they asked his name, he denied everything. Even as they fingerprinted him, he insisted he was Bob Clark. But fingerprints don't lie. When the match came back, the game was over. The mask was ripped off. John List, the boogeyman of Westfield, had been found. During his trial, John remained as cold as the day he made that sandwich. He expressed no remorse for the lives he ended. He argued, with chilling calmness, that he had saved them. He believed that because he had killed them while they were Christians, they were waiting for him in heaven. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. In a final twist of irony, he died in prison in 2008, succumbing to pneumonia, alone, just days after the anniversary of the massacre. John List believed he was an agent of God, but his actions revealed him to be a disciple of the ultimate selfishness. He annihilated his family not to save their souls, but to save his own reputation. He couldn't bear to be seen as a failure, so he chose to be remembered as a monster. The image of him eating that sandwich, stepping over the body of the woman he vowed to cherish, stands as one of the most disturbing moments in the history of true crime. It represents a void where a human soul should be a complete absence of empathy, filled only with cold bureaucratic logic. We often wonder what evil looks like. We expect it to be loud, chaotic, and obvious. But John List teaches us that evil can be quiet. It can be organized. It can be polite. Evil can be a man who washes the dishes after a massacre because he doesn't want to leave a mess. He spent 18 years living a borrowed life, breathing air that his children were denied, convinced of his own righteousness until his dying breath. As we close this dossier, I want you to look at your neighbors a little differently tomorrow. The quiet ones, the ones who always follow the rules, because you never truly know what is happening behind the closed doors of a perfect house. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, share it with a friend who thinks they have heard it all. Like the video to support the channel, and don't forget to comment below with the country and city you are watching from. I'll see you in the shadows of the next story. Stay safe, and keep your mask tight.